good evening, and welcome back. Wherever you are tonight, whether it is very late and quiet, or still early enough that the house has not fully settled yet, I'm glad you're here. And if you feel like it, you can leave a like, or subscribe, or tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. There is never any pressure with that. I just like the thought of these stories traveling softly through different rooms, different countries, different little pockets of sleeplessness. Tonight, I want to stay with something that seems, at first, almost too ordinary to notice. A child leaving home, not dramatically, not with trumpets, not with a grand farewell. Just a child somewhere around 12 or 13, or perhaps a little older, being taken from one household and placed into another, and everyone around him behaving as though this were practical, sensible, and perhaps even good for him, which, by the standards of the time, it often was. That is one of the uncomfortable things about the medieval world. Very often, the harsh arrangement was not hidden inside cruelty. It was hidden inside normality. It lived inside phrases like useful, proper, respectable, necessary. It lived inside nods, exchanged between adults. It lived inside bread accounts, rent worries, crowded beds, and the simple arithmetic of too many mouths and not enough room for sentiment. And so a boy might be 12 and not exactly sold, not in the neat, theatrical way modern people like to imagine, but bound, promised, signed over in a form everyone insisted was reasonable. He would be fed, perhaps, housed, certainly of some kind, taught a trade in theory, disciplined very much in practice, watched, corrected, worked, worn in, and slowly reshaped until he belonged less to his birth household and more to the one that had taken him in. Childhood, in other words, could be packed up and sent elsewhere, not because anyone sat down one day and invented a grand philosophy called childhood as contract. Medieval society was not usually so elegant. It preferred to stumble into systems and then defend them as ancient wisdom. More often, something began as a temporary necessity, a labor shortage here, a hungry household there, a master who needed hands, a widow who could not keep another son at home, a city that kept growing and needed bodies to fill shops, kitchens, stalls, workrooms, warehouses, lanes full of smoke, alleys full of shouting, and all the little spaces where labor went to become invisible. At first, perhaps, it was just practical. A child old enough to carry, sweep, fetch, stir, watch, lift, run messages, hold tools, clean scraps, mind a counter, sleep on a pallet, and keep out of the way unless needed was a child old enough to be useful. And once usefulness enters the room, tenderness tends to leave by the side door. So they developed arrangements, not always formal at first, not always written down in the way later generations preferred, just habits, expectations, understandings. A boy goes to live with a master. A girl is placed in service. A relative knows someone in town. A priest knows a craftsman. No. A family has too many children and not enough bread. Somebody says it would only be for a few years. Somebody else says the child will learn something. Everyone repeats this until it begins to sound virtuous. That is how many enduring institutions are born, not from brilliance, from shrugging. And 12 is such an interesting age for all this, because 12 is still, to us, painfully young. 12 is awkwardness and narrow wrists, and not quite knowing how to stand still in a room. 12 is an age when the face can still look soft and unfinished. But in a medieval setting, 12 is already drifting toward usefulness. Not full adulthood, no, and not full skill either, but enough strength to begin being transferred, enough comprehension to obey, enough endurance to be tested, and enough dependence to be controlled, which is a very efficient combination, if efficiency is all you care about. And medieval society often cared about efficiency in the least charming way possible. Not efficient in a polished modern sense. Not efficient like a machine. Medieval systems were usually clumsy, repetitive, full of loopholes, church days, local customs, bad roads, damp straw, and men named Thomas arguing over things no one should have needed to argue about. But they were efficient at one thing above all else, and that was turning human need into durable obligation. A family needed relief. A master needed labor. A town needed workers. A guild needed structure. The countryside needed hands kept close to the fields. The law needed categories. The church needed moral supervision. And somehow all of these needs met in the body of a child. A child was useful because he was unfinished. An adult laborer comes with habits, opinions, price expectations, a sense of grievance, possibly missing teeth, and the dangerous knowledge that he has seen worse employers and could leave for another. A child comes with none of that fully formed. A child can be trained, yes, but also bent, directed, contained inside a household before he learns the full scale of his own inconvenience. And that household mattered. It is important, though no one in the medieval world would phrase it this way over supper. That apprenticeship was rarely just about work. It was about absorbing a child into another domestic universe, another table, another fire, another set of rules about speech, sleep, washing, obedience, and silence. Another woman deciding how much pottage he received. Another man deciding whether he had worked slowly, spoken sharply, or looked idle in a way that deserved correction. The child did not simply enter a trade, he entered someone else's weather. That may be the truest way to describe it. He moved from one climate of authority into another. At home, perhaps, he knew the moods of his mother, the tiredness of his father, the way the door stuck in wet weather, the corner where rushes were always thin, the taste of the family pot, the old joke an uncle repeated too often, the place where he could lean when he wanted to disappear. Then suddenly he belonged to another house, where even the air felt differently arranged. The smells alone would have announced the change. Ash, wool grease, wet leather, sour ale, hot iron, stale rushes, onions, soap if the household was fortunate, urine if it was less so, damp cloth, drying by a weak fire, tallow smoke collecting under beams, old wood, cold stone, cabbage water, sometimes vinegar, sometimes fish, sometimes people who had worked since dawn and had not the slightest intention of smelling pleasant for anyone's comfort. And yet this transfer could be spoken of as opportunity, which, to be fair, it sometimes was. That is the trap. The system survived not because it was always monstrous, but because it could sometimes produce exactly what it promised: a skilled trade, a place in town, better prospects than the village, access to urban life, social ascent occasionally, respectability perhaps, bread more regularly than at home, a chance, in the long stretch of years, to become something other than another exhausted pair of hands in the same strip of land one's father had already worn half to death. So a temporary solution became a respectable path. That happens often in history. Something begins as improvisation, then acquires language, then rules, then rituals, then penalties, and eventually it begins looking so settled that people forget it was ever makeshift. A child placed out for practical reasons, becomes an apprentice. A household bargain becomes a contract. A local habit becomes a civic expectation. An arrangement nobody quite trusts becomes the backbone of urban labor. And once that happens, something even stranger begins. People start defending the system not because it is humane, and not even because it always works, but because they can no longer imagine the city functioning without it. Now the baker needs a boy, the smith needs a boy, the tailor needs a boy, the merchant needs a boy who can count just enough not to disgrace the day's receipts. The workshop needs someone to fetch water and fuel and stand in the doorway and be present whenever an older hand vanishes for a suspiciously long, ale-related reason. The house itself needs one more person near the bottom of its order, someone to send when something unpleasant must be done quickly and without negotiation. And once enough households depend on this, the entire town begins to depend on it too. The city starts feeding on incoming youth, not in a dramatic way. Medieval towns did very little dramatically on purpose. They preferred accumulation. A few children from here, a few from there, cousins, sons of tenants, fatherless boys, daughters placed into service, younger sons who could not remain where they were, children nudged away from crowded homes with all the language of practical affection. They arrived, and the city swallowed them into lanes, shops, lofts, kitchens, stalls, and dim little chambers under roofs where the wind found every crack. And then, because the city had become used to this supply, the arrangement stopped feeling temporary. That is one of the crueler magic tricks of social systems. They begin as emergency stitching and end as skin. If plague had changed the labor market, then children could be redirected. If the countryside feared losing workers, then laws could be adjusted. If masters worried about too much competition, then rules could be tightened. If poor households needed relief, then placing a child elsewhere could be praised as sensible. Every inconvenience generated another small adjustment, and every adjustment left residue. Eventually the residues hardened into custom. You can almost feel it happening. Somewhere, perhaps, a family first sends a boy away because that year is bad, because grain is dear, because another child is sick, because the father's work has gone thin, because an uncle in town has spoken to someone. It is, everyone says, only what must be done for now. And then other families do the same. And then town authorities notice that such arrangements are useful, and then craft bodies notice that it would be helpful to control them, and then someone writes down terms, and then someone else finds a master for breaking them, and then still someone else insists. This is how proper training has always been done. Always is one of history's most dishonest words. It usually means, for longer than anyone in the room can remember, which is not the same thing at all. And so a child of 12, or thereabouts, finds himself standing at the edge of a threshold he does not fully understand. Perhaps he has been told he is fortunate. Perhaps he has been scrubbed harder than usual. Perhaps his best garment has been found, shaken out, and declared sufficient. Perhaps his mother has spoken briskly all morning because tenderness would make the whole business harder. Perhaps his father has adopted the stern tone men use when they would rather not appear frightened by necessity. Perhaps there has been a walk to town, perhaps a cart, perhaps a silence full of practical remarks about weather and road conditions and the price of grain, because practical remarks are easier than saying plainly that a child is being handed over to strangers in exchange for the hope that usefulness will save him. And the child himself may not even think of it as tragedy. That is another quiet irony. Children often accept the shape of the world offered to them, at least at first. He may be afraid, yes, but also curious. He may be watching the city with wide eyes. He may notice roofs packed close together, dogs moving under carts, the shine of metalwork in shopfront gloom, scraps of dyed cloth, the sound of hammering, a bell somewhere, the smell of baking somewhere else, the thrilling suspicion that life is larger than his village told him. He may think, in some half-formed way, that he is entering importance, and in a sense he is. Not personal importance. Medieval society was not especially generous with that for boys of 12. But structural importance. He is entering the machinery. He is becoming one of those small, replaceable pieces without which the machine complains, stutters, and eventually stops. That is what makes the whole arrangement feel so calm on the surface and so unnerving underneath. Nobody needs to shout, nobody needs to call it a sale, nobody needs to use theatrical cruelty. The contract can be tidy, the voices can remain level, the promises can sound respectable. Food, bed, discipline, instruction, obedience, all very proper, all very ordinary. And that is exactly why it lasts. Because the world is not usually held together by grand evils in velvet cloaks. It is held together by ordinary people agreeing that a child is now old enough to be moved. And once a child can be moved, he can be counted. Once he can be counted, he can be allocated. Once he can be allocated, he can be governed. And once he can be governed in one household, for the sake of labor, discipline, and future usefulness, then everyone will start inventing reasons why this is not only necessary, but good for him, which is a very medieval talent, and not an entirely medieval one, because people in every century have loved nothing more than taking a desperate arrangement, dressing it in moral language, and calling it character building somewhere. No doubt there was a master who truly believed this. Somewhere there was a boy who did learn a trade, who did rise, who did remember the whole business with gratitude or at least without bitterness. History always produces enough exceptions to keep bad systems well supplied with defenders. But even then, the first fact remains. At around 12, a child could become transferable, not fully a man, not still simply a child, something in between, and therefore extremely vulnerable to whatever a society wished to make of that in-between state. Too young for power, old enough for use. That is where many labor systems like to begin. And once they begin, they rarely stay as small as they first pretend to be. They creep. They gather rules. They accumulate moral phrases. They borrow authority from church, town, law, custom, hunger, and ambition. They settle into benches and account books and workshop floors and household routines. And before long, something that may have begun as a temporary answer to practical trouble becomes one of the regular ways a civilization moves its children around. Not because it is beautiful, not because it is just, because it is useful, and because adults get terribly attached to whatever keeps the room functioning for one more winter, and in the next room, perhaps, there is already a bed being considered. Not a very good bed, of course. No institution ever begins by offering the best bed. By the time the child crossed the threshold, most of the important decisions had already been made by other people. That, perhaps, is the first lesson of entering another man's house. You arrive late to your own future. The adults have already spoken. They have already measured one another with those long medieval glances that somehow combine piety, caution, suspicion, fatigue, and arithmetic all at once. They have already decided what sort of arrangement this will be. They have likely discussed food, though not warmly. They have likely discussed sleeping space, though perhaps with less precision than one might wish when the sleeping space in question is your body. They have likely said the word training, because adults enjoy saying noble words when exchanging practical burdens. And somewhere in all this, the child has been turned from a person with a place in one house into a person expected in another, which sounds almost elegant when phrased that way. In practice, it meant finding out where you would sleep. And the medieval household had many sleeping arrangements, some of them technically legal, many of them technically possible, and very few of them what anyone now would call appealing. A master's house was not arranged around the emotional needs of a newly arrived apprentice. It was arranged around utility, warmth, storage, habit, and the fact that buildings were expensive while children were comparatively cheap. So the boy might sleep in a loft over the workshop, where the air held the smell of the trade itself. If he belonged to a tailor, perhaps cloth dust, damp wool, stale rushes, and tallow. If he belonged to a smith, then smoke, metal, ash, and the persistent feeling that everything in the building had once been hot and might yet become hot again. If he belonged to a baker, perhaps warmth in the walls and flour in the cracks of the floorboards. If he belonged to a shoemaker, leather, glue, scraps, and that strange mixture of animal and effort that seems to cling to places where skins are cut and bent into civility. Or he might sleep not above the work, but among the household itself, which was not necessarily better. Medieval domestic life was intimate in all the wrong ways. People shared space because there was no great principle of privacy demanding otherwise. Curtains, boxes, pallets, benches, loft corners, side rooms if fortune smiled, workshop floors if fortune was drunk, all these might serve. One did not ask whether a child needed solitude. Solitude was a luxury usually reserved for saints, hermits, and men rich enough to be unpleasant in private, so perhaps he is shown a pallet, not shown generously, of course. The medieval world rarely staged comfort. More likely it is indicated with a nod, or with the end of a sentence. There, that one, move those, not that blanket, that belongs elsewhere. You are here now. And that little phrase contains a universe. You are here now. Not home, here. There is a kind of blunt magic in being told where to sleep. Adults think they are settling a practical matter, and of course they are, but they are also redrawing the border of the self. A child belongs where he sleeps. That is one of the oldest rules in human life. Not where he was born, not where he is remembered, not where his mother still turns her head sometimes out of reflex because she half expects him in the doorway. He belongs where his body is laid down at night, where he wakes cold or warm, where he learns the sound of someone else coughing in the dark, where he counts beams above him, where he listens for footsteps and tries to understand by sound alone what mood the house has awakened in. A house has moods before breakfast. This is important. Modern people like to imagine institutions as clean abstractions. Medieval people were more honest. Their institutions smelled of soup and damp wool and old anger. Apprenticeship happened not in tidy legal air, but inside a breathing household. The master's temper mattered. The mistress's habits mattered. The order of seating at meals mattered. Whether the dog bit strangers mattered. Whether the older servants resented new mouths mattered. Whether the fire was kept high or meanly mattered. Whether leftovers were distributed with fairness, indifference, or little sharp humiliations mattered very much indeed. And food was never just food. A contract might promise sustenance. Adults loved that word because it sounded morally upholstered. Sustenance, maintenance, board, keep. Such steady words, such respectable words. But to a child in another man's house, food meant 100 smaller questions. How much? How often? Before or after the others? Fresh or left over? Shared from the same pot or scraped from the edge of it? Was meat ever likely, or only on the kind of day that also involved a saint, a feast, or someone else paying? A household could keep you alive and still teach you exactly where you stood. Perhaps he receives pottage, rough bread, ale watered or weak, cheese when the house allows itself that sort of optimism, onions, broth, bits of fish on the proper days, perhaps drippings, perhaps cabbage, perhaps beans that have boiled so long they seem less like food than a patient argument with water. None of this is especially unusual. That is the trouble. Harshness is often most durable when it is unremarkable. And yet, even within that unremarkable diet, status speaks. Who gets the crust? Who gets the softer piece? Who is expected to wait? Who may reach? Who is watched while reaching? Who is corrected for eagerness? Who is told that in this house we do not snatch, do not stare at the board, do not eat like wolves, do not speak with full mouths, do not mistake feeding for belonging? A child learns the culture of a house first through hunger, not starvation necessarily, something subtler, measured dependence, the small humiliations of being provided for by people who want your labor more reliably than your company. That sounds severe, and often it was, but not always unkind in the theatrical sense. Medieval households could be rough without being deliberately sadistic. They were simply built on assumptions that now feel almost indecently blunt. If a boy worked, he ate. If he obeyed, he stayed. If he learned, good. If he became useful, better. If he became attached, that was incidental. If he became homesick, that was inconvenient. If he cried at night, well, hopefully not where anyone had to listen for too long. And then there was clothing. No one likes to imagine clothing as a form of power because clothing sounds decorative, and medieval clothing very often was not. But to control what a child wore, when his shoes were replaced, whether his hose were patched, whether he had clean linen, whether he looked respectable enough to stand near customers, whether he was given cast-off garments from older members of the household, all this was to control how he moved through the world. An apprentice might be promised clothes, or shoes, or maintenance of them, and these details sound so petty until one remembers that without shoes, a boy is not merely uncomfortable. He is visibly poor, physically slowed, and publicly marked. A sole separating from the upper can become a social statement very quickly. So a master who provided shoes was not simply generous. He was preserving the functioning of his investment. The child must walk, fetch, carry, stand, and represent the household in public space. Raggedness was not always a moral issue, despite how often moralists tried to make it one. Sometimes raggedness just made the workshop look bad. This is one of those subtle jokes history keeps telling. People say a child is clothed out of care, and often there is some care in it. But just as often, the real motive is that nothing embarrasses authority like a servant who looks as though authority is failing at the basics. And then we come, inevitably, to washing, which is a less glamorous subject, but for that very reason it belongs here. The medieval household was a place where laundry mattered in the way all difficult things matter, constantly, irritably, and without poetry. Linen had to be washed. Bodies had to be rendered tolerable. Bedding had to endure. Work dirt had to be managed even when it could not be defeated. And for a child entering service or apprenticeship, washing was not merely hygiene. It was incorporation into the domestic cycle. Someone must decide when your shirt is worth cleaning, whether your blanket is foul enough to justify effort, whether your hands are dirty by the standards of labor or dirty by the standards of insult. That difference matters more than one might think. A boy blackened by work may be useful. A boy blackened into disrespect reflects badly on the household. Medieval standards were not modern standards, but they were standards. Disorder had a smell, and households were always negotiating how much of it they could tolerate before it became shame. So the apprentice enters not only a job, but a rhythm. Wake with the house, or before it. Stir to sounds not yet familiar. Someone moving in the dark, the shifting of wood, the dull sound of a pot, a cough from somewhere deeper in the building, boots, perhaps. The quiet, malicious confidence of cold air in the early morning, perhaps prayer, perhaps just motion. Medieval households, like all households that depend on labor, do not ask whether one feels ready. The day begins because the day has decided to begin. He dresses quickly, likely awkwardly at first, learning which garment belongs to which peg or box or corner, learning what can be touched and what cannot, learning that another family's possessions possess a kind of invisible border around them. There are things you may carry and things you may never presume to move. There are tools kept in one place, knives in another, the better cloth higher up, the worse cloth nearer hand. The broom where it always stands, because no one in this house has the time to indulge foolishness. Everything has a place, but not because anyone loves order for its own sake. Because in a crowded working house, misplacing an object is a small crime against time. That is another thing children entering apprenticeship had to learn. The house is not patient. It may tolerate ignorance briefly, but only if ignorance shows signs of dying quickly. A child who does not yet know where the bucket is, where the scraps go, how the fire is drawn, when the shutters open, which bowl belongs to whom, how the bench is cleared, which cloth is for work and which for sale, such a child is not innocent in the sentimental sense. He is merely inefficient. And inefficiency is very hard to romanticize when breakfast is thin and daylight is already being spent. So many permanent customs are born from this kind of impatience. That is worth lingering over. A household does something one way, because once, perhaps years ago, some small confusion wasted time, spoiled materials, angered a customer, or caused a quarrel before dawn. The solution is improvised. Put the lad there, store the twine here, keep the apprentice's bed near the loft steps, make him eat after the others, have him sleep close enough to hear if he is needed. Give him the old shoes, tell him not to touch the better knife, and then, because the solution works well enough, it becomes custom. No one remembers the original inconvenience. They only remember that in this house we do it this way. This house. Such a large phrase for so small a kingdom, because that is what a master's house was, in miniature. A kingdom of narrow authority, not grand, not polished, not remotely fair in any modern sense, but deeply structured. The master ruled work. The mistress often ruled much of everything else in ways no less absolute for being domestic. Older servants or journeymen possessed the petty power of those who are no longer lowest and are determined to enjoy that fact. The apprentice entered at the bottom and learned quickly that every rung above him would occasionally rest its boot on his fingers. This too could be spoken of as character formation. Medieval society adored the idea that discomfort was educational. Sometimes it is. More often, it is simply discomfort with a sermon tied to it. But let us be fair. There were households where the apprentice was treated adequately, even kindly in a stern old way. He might be fed decently, scolded without cruelty, corrected with some patience, and gradually woven into the habits of the place until the strange house became familiar enough to stop hurting. That happened too. The point is not that every master was a monster. The point is that the entire system relied on the child having almost no power to choose which kind of house he had entered. A good house and a bad house could look similar from outside: a painted sign, a workable roof, a respectable trade, a master of decent standing, a pious phrase or two, a contract if the matter was formal enough, bread on the table, smoke from the chimney. Nothing in all that tells a parent, still less a child, how the nights will feel. Nothing reveals whether correction will be measured or savage, whether mistakes will be treated as part of learning or as insults to authority, whether homesickness will be mocked, whether labor will slowly turn into skill or remain forever errands and grime. And because the household was the institution, so much depended on temper. That is the maddening fragility of these supposedly solid systems. People speak of apprenticeship as if it were a framework, and it was, but frameworks are lived through personalities. A fair-tempered master turns discipline into routine. A vain master turns it into theatre. A lazy master neglects training. A grasping master turns the apprentice into cheap labor. A weary mistress lets small things pass. A sharp one notices everything. A sick household becomes a harsh one very quickly. A prosperous one may become more generous or more demanding, because prosperity often convinces people their preferences are principles. And the child, meanwhile, lies down each night where he has been placed. Maybe the bed is only straw on boards. Maybe it is a truckle, dragged in and out. Maybe it is a space in the loft where he learns the shape of rafters better than the shape of his own future. Maybe he sleeps near another apprentice, or a servant, or some uncertain pile of storage that smells faintly of mice and strongly of the trade. Maybe winter enters through cracks. Maybe summer thickens the air until breathing itself feels like work. Maybe rain speaks through the roof in one season, and wind in another. Maybe the blanket is enough. Maybe it is not. But this is where the temporary solution begins its long transformation into permanence. Because the bed is not just where he sleeps, it is where the institution sinks into him. Each night in another man's house teaches the same lesson without words. Your body can be relocated for usefulness. Your comfort is negotiable. Your routines are now governed elsewhere. The household that feeds you also owns the shape of your exhaustion, and after enough nights, even strangeness becomes ordinary. That is one of history's saddest efficiencies. A child who wept in the first week may stop by the third, not because the arrangement has improved, but because the body is an obedient creature and learns its cage with embarrassing speed. He learns where the boards creak. He learns how long the fire holds warmth. He learns whether the master rises angry or merely silent. He learns whether there is any use saving the heel of bread from supper for the first pain of morning. He learns which older hand might sometimes whisper advice and which one will delight in his mistakes. He learns how to sleep while not entirely relaxed, which is an adult skill many people acquire far too early. And then, after a while, the house begins to feel inevitable. That is when custom has done its work. No one any longer needs to explain why the child is there. He is there because apprentices are there, because boys come from elsewhere. Because workshops absorb them, because beds are found for them, because food is allotted, because shoes are replaced if the house can manage it and postponed if it cannot. Because this is how useful people are made, or at least how they are told they are being made. And when enough houses repeat this pattern, a town begins to think of it as natural. The baker's boy, the smith's boy, the merchant's boy, the tailor's lad, the maid who came in from another village, the child sleeping under another roof, rising to another command, learning another family's noises, not exceptional, not tragic, simply part of the arrangement of things. That, more than any dramatic contract language, is what gives the system its force. It settles into ordinary life so thoroughly that even its absurdities become invisible. It is absurd, when one pauses, that a society should say to a child, "You are not yet grown, therefore you must be governed," and then hand him into labor so demanding, so intimate, and so binding that most modern adults would object violently to living under it for a fortnight. It is absurd that training should begin with bed placement, bowl order, and shoe rationing. It is absurd that something presented as opportunity should so often begin by stripping away the simplest experience of home. But absurdity, once repeated often enough, becomes tradition. And tradition is only absurdity that has found respectable shoes. The boy may not know any of this, lying there in the dark of another man's house. He may only know the immediate facts. The blanket scratches, someone snores. Somewhere below, a last ember settles. The building smells unfamiliar. The city outside does not sleep like the village did. There are wheels later into the night, voices that do not belong to kin, a distant dog, rain perhaps, bells sometimes, the whole place alive with the unnerving suggestion that life is happening beyond his understanding, and tomorrow the work will begin again before he has had time to decide whether he belongs here. That too becomes part of the method. Do not let the child sit too long with the strangeness. Give him tasks. Give him movement. Give him fatigue. Tiredness is one of authority's best allies. A weary child adjusts more quickly than a rested one. There is subtle genius in that, though genius is too flattering a word. Let us call it what it is, an old human habit of solving emotional discomfort with labor. And once the labor settles in, the bed starts to feel less like an exile and more like a station. Temporary, perhaps, at first, for a term, for some years, until trained, until older, until something else can be made of him. But medieval institutions had a funny way of making the temporary feel like weather, and weather feel like destiny. A bed in another man's house, given for practical reasons, becomes the first room in a much larger structure. Discipline will follow, the trade will follow, or something calling itself the trade. The household rules will deepen, the city will claim more of him. The contract, formal or half-spoken, will spread into every hour, and before long, the child may discover that he was not sent merely to learn a craft. He was sent to learn how to belong to work. And that is a lesson best taught, apparently, beside someone else's fire, under someone else's roof, in a bed that was never chosen. In the morning, the idea of learning begins very quietly. No one announces it. There is no ceremony where the master turns, smiles with measured dignity, and says, "Today, we begin your training." Medieval life rarely paused to honor beginnings. It preferred to bury them inside work and let you discover, much later, that something had already started without asking you. So the boy wakes, and the first thing he learns is not the trade. It is how to move without being in the way, which is, in many households, considered a far more valuable skill. He learns how to stand just far enough from the master to be useful, but not so close as to invite irritation. He learns where to place his hands when he is waiting. He learns that waiting is not the absence of work, but a form of it. He learns that if he looks idle, even while waiting for instruction, he will be corrected, because idleness is not measured by effort, but by appearance. And appearance, in a working household, is a delicate, constantly observed performance. So he begins with the small things. Fetch this, carry that, hold this steady, not like that. Watch. No, watch properly. Are you watching? And this is how training introduces itself. Not as knowledge, but as correction. It comes in fragments. A hand pushed aside, a word repeated, a tool taken from him and used in front of him with exaggerated clarity, as though the master is teaching not only the task, but the fact that the boy has failed to understand it, which, in fairness, he has. But failure, here, is not a stage. It is a nuisance, and nuisances must be reduced. So the boy learns quickly that learning is less about curiosity and more about avoiding being wrong in the same way twice. This, too, has a kind of logic. In a world where materials cost money, where mistakes waste time, where customers complain, where the master's reputation is not an abstract thing but the thin thread holding together his livelihood, patience is not always available in generous supply. A child who learns slowly is not charming. He is expensive. And so the system adjusts. It does not abandon the idea of training. That would sound improper. It simply compresses it into something harder, sharper, more immediate. The boy will learn, yes, but he will learn while working, and he will work whether he is learning or not, which is where the confusion begins, because at some point it becomes difficult to tell whether he is an apprentice or simply a servant who happens to be near a trade. The two are not identical, but, in practice, they often share the same day. He sweeps, he cleans, he fetches water, he carries materials, he runs messages, he watches the door, he answers simple questions, he repeats instructions, he is sent out. Again, he returns, he is sent out again. The rhythm of this becomes so constant that it acquires the dignity of routine, and routine is the most convincing disguise a system can wear. Once something happens every day, in roughly the same way, with roughly the same expectations, it stops feeling like improvisation. It begins to feel like structure. People begin to say, "This is how it is done," which is another of those phrases that hides more than it reveals. Because often, it was not how it was done at first. It was how it worked well enough. Perhaps, once, a master had taken an apprentice and devoted long hours to teaching him carefully, step by step, ensuring he understood not only the motions, but the reasoning behind them. Perhaps this master had more time, or fewer worries, or a different temperament. Perhaps the boy progressed well, and the arrangement looked admirable. And then, perhaps, another master tried something similar, and found that while he was patiently instructing, work piled up. Customers waited, materials spoiled, and the day slipped away in a way that felt dangerously close to loss. So he adjusted. He gave the boy tasks that also happened to be necessary. He taught in moments rather than in lessons. He corrected as he worked. He reduced explanation to what could be shouted across a bench or demonstrated in the span of a breath. And because this approach kept the shop moving, it stayed. This is how temporary solutions become permanent, not because they are better, but because they interfere less with survival. So now the boy is both learning and working, but the balance between those two is rarely stable. Some days, perhaps, he watches closely. He sees how the tool is held, how pressure is applied, how material is judged by touch, by sound, by a glance that seems too quick to contain knowledge but somehow does. He begins to imitate. He makes mistakes. He is corrected. He tries again. There is a sense, faint but real, that something is being passed from one pair of hands to another. On other days, there is no such illusion. The work is too heavy, too urgent, too repetitive. There is no time for instruction, only for doing. And the doing is not the refined part of the trade. It is the groundwork, the endless preparation, the cleaning, the carrying, the keeping of things in motion so that the skilled hands can remain skilled. And in those moments, the word apprentice begins to feel like a promise postponed, which, in many cases, it was, not necessarily broken, just delayed long enough to be useful. The boy may not notice this immediately. At first, everything is new, and novelty can disguise repetition for a surprisingly long time. Carrying a bucket for the first week is an event. Carrying it for the third month is a condition. By the sixth, it is almost invisible, except in the shoulders. And that is another quiet transformation. The body learns before the mind admits it has learned. Muscles adjust, hands toughen, feet accept discomfort as normal. Sleep deepens, not from peace, but from exhaustion. Hunger becomes predictable, and within all this, something like skill begins to form, but not always where one expects it. He learns how to anticipate. This is, perhaps, the most valuable lesson no one officially teaches. He learns to see what will be needed before it is asked for, the cloth before it is called, the tool before it is demanded, the water before it is missed, the fire before it fades, the customer before he speaks, the master's mood before it breaks. This is not a craft skill in the noble sense, but it is a survival skill, and survival skills have a way of becoming permanent, even when the system that required them has changed. So the boy becomes useful, not in the grand way his parents might have imagined, not yet a craftsman shaping the world with confident hands, but useful in the quieter, more immediate way that keeps a household functioning. And usefulness, once established, has a way of expanding its own territory. If a boy can carry, he can carry more. If he can clean better. If he can run messages, he can run them faster. If he can be trusted not to lose things, he can be trusted with slightly more important things. And if he can be trusted, then he can be relied upon. And once he is relied upon, the household begins to depend on him in ways that were never written down in any agreement. This is where the system reveals one of its more delicate ironies. The better the apprentice becomes at serving the immediate needs of the Prus household, the more valuable he is in that role, and the less urgent it may feel to advance him into the more complex parts of the trade. After all, someone must do the lower work. Someone must maintain the rhythm. Someone must ensure that the master's hands remain free for the tasks that bring in money, reputation, and status. And if the apprentice is particularly good at being that someone, then the system has quietly succeeded in turning him into exactly what it needs. Whether that aligns with what he was promised becomes a secondary concern. This is not necessarily cruelty, it is inertia, and inertia is one of the most powerful forces in any human arrangement. Once a pattern proves useful, it resists change, even if the change would be fair, even if the change would fulfill the original intention, even if the change would transform the apprentice from a pair of hands into something more. The day is already full. The work is already waiting. The master is already tired. The household already depends on the existing rhythm. Tomorrow, perhaps, later, when there is time. And there is almost never time. So training becomes something that happens in the margins. A moment here, a correction there, a demonstration squeezed between tasks. A rare afternoon when the pace slows enough for the master to explain not just how, but why. These moments exist, they matter, they are remembered. They are also not enough, on their own, to define the whole experience. Which is why, when we speak of apprenticeship as learning a trade, we are telling only part of the story. The other part is that the boy is learning how to live inside someone else's expectations. He learns when to speak, when not to, when to look up, when to look down, when to move quickly, when to become invisible, when to accept correction without argument, when to pretend he has understood something he has not, because asking again may be more dangerous than failing once. He learns that knowledge is not always given freely. Sometimes it must be observed, stolen in glances, assembled slowly from fragments, pieced together from what is seen rather than what is explained. This too becomes a tradition, not because anyone sat down and decided that knowledge should be difficult to obtain, but because difficulty was built into the structure of the day. A master who is busy does not lecture. He demonstrates, he corrects, he moves on, and the apprentice must keep up or be left behind. And if he is left behind, there is always more carrying to be done, more sweeping, more errands, more work that requires no skill beyond obedience. So the boy develops a second kind of attention, not just watching what is shown to him, but watching what is not meant for him. He listens when the master speaks to a customer. He observes how prices are discussed. He notices how mistakes are hidden or explained. He sees how materials are judged. He learns the small deceptions, the polite exaggerations, the quiet compromises that make a trade function in the real world rather than in its ideal description. This is education of a sort, not always the kind anyone would write proudly in a contract, but no less real, and over time these fragments accumulate. The boy who once could not hold a tool correctly now holds it without thinking. The boy who once needed constant direction now anticipates. The boy who once carried only water now carries responsibility in small, unspoken ways. And yet, even as this happens, the original ambiguity remains. Is he a student or is he a worker? The answer, as with many medieval arrangements, is both, which is to say, it depends on the moment, the need, the mood, the pressure of the day, the condition of the household, the state of the master's patience, the demands of customers, the weather, the season, and the endless small contingencies that shape human life. There is no clean line, and because there is no clean line, the system can stretch. It can claim to be training when it is using. It can claim to be disciplining when it is controlling. It can claim to be preparing when it is postponing. And all of these claims can be true at once. That is the real genius, if one must use that word, of such arrangements. They do not require consistency, only continuation. As long as the boy remains, works, learns something, and eventually moves on or is replaced, the system considers itself successful. Whether he has become what was promised is a more delicate question, one that is not always asked loudly, because asking it too loudly might disturb the rhythm, and the rhythm, by now, is everything. Morning, work, correction, errands, food, work again, fatigue, sleep, repeat, days blur, Weeks fold into one another, seasons shift, and somewhere within that long, repetitive passage, the boy begins to understand something that no one ever explained to him directly. That learning in this place is not a separate activity. It is something that happens while being useful, or not at all. At some point, someone decided to make a rule, not a grand rule, not one of those sweeping declarations that kings enjoy issuing and everyone else enjoys ignoring. No, something smaller, something practical, the kind of rule that sounds like it belongs to a conversation rather than a law. Perhaps it began with a complaint. Too many boys leaving the countryside, too many fields left with fewer hands than they needed, too many young bodies disappearing into towns where they became something else. Apprentices, perhaps, servants, assistants, shop boys, useful in ways that did not involve soil. And this, naturally, caused concern, because medieval society was very good at worrying about where people were standing, not in a philosophical sense, in a very literal one. Who is in the field? Who is in the town? Who is working? Who is idle? Who has left without permission? Who is staying when they should not? These questions, repeated often enough, begin to sound like governance. So someone says, perhaps quietly at first, that children who have been working the land until a certain age should not simply leave. 12, maybe, or thereabouts, an age that feels conveniently precise without being truly exact. And it sounds reasonable, doesn't it? The fields need them. The families depend on them. The village cannot afford to lose every young pair of hands just because the town smells of opportunity. So a rule is suggested, not forever, just for now, just until things settle. Just until labor is stable again. Just until people remember where they belong. This is how almost every permanent system introduces itself, with the phrase, just for now, because just for now is disarming. It suggests flexibility. It suggests that no one is trying to control the future, only to manage the present. And yet, once written, or spoken often enough, or enforced even lightly, such rules begin to take on a second life. They stop being responses. They start becoming expectations. A boy is 12. He has worked in the fields. Therefore, he stays. Not because anyone has freshly evaluated his situation, because that is what is done. And once something becomes what is done, it gains a kind of gravity. It pulls behavior toward it. Parents begin to assume it. Masters begin to expect it. Officials begin to enforce it, sometimes out of conviction, sometimes out of habit. It takes sometimes simply because enforcing rules is what officials do when they wish to appear useful. And the boy, meanwhile, experiences none of this as policy. He experiences it as a narrowing of options, which is a quieter thing, but no less real, because while one set of rules is trying to hold him in place, another set, often less formal, but no less powerful, is trying to draw him elsewhere. The town is always hungry. That is its nature. Not dramatically hungry, not visibly devouring children in some theatrical way, but steadily, quietly, with doors that open, with masters who need help, with workshops that always seem to have room for one more boy, if only someone can be convinced to make space. So the same society that says stay also says come. And rather than resolving this contradiction, it lives inside it. This is important. Medieval systems are not clean. They do not eliminate tension, they preserve it. The countryside says, "We need you here." The town says, "We need you there." The law says, "You should remain." The opportunity says, "You should leave." The family says, "We cannot keep you." The master says, "I can use you." And somewhere in between all these voices, a rule emerges that tries, unsuccessfully, to decide what should happen. But failure, in this context, is not a weakness. It is a feature. Because a rule that is only partially enforced, only sometimes obeyed, and constantly negotiated is not useless. It is flexible. It allows authority to exist without fully closing off reality. And so the rule persists. Not because it is perfect, because it is convenient. It can be invoked when needed, ignored when necessary, adjusted in tone without being rewritten. It becomes part of the background. And that is where permanence hides best, not in loud enforcement, in quiet assumption. Over time, people forget the original reason. They stop talking about labor shortages. They stop referencing the specific crisis that gave birth to the rule. They simply say, "Boys of this age do not leave," or "they should not," or "they require permission," or "they must follow certain conditions." And those conditions grow. They always grow. Because once a rule exists, it invites additions, clarifications, exceptions, penalties. And before long, something that began as a simple attempt to keep children in the fields becomes a small forest of expectations. A boy cannot leave without approval. A boy must serve where he is placed. A boy must be bound properly. A boy must not wander. A boy must not become idle. A boy must not disrupt the balance. All of this sounds orderly, and in a way it is. But order, in the medieval sense, is not the absence of chaos. It is the management of it. And children are particularly convenient to manage. They have not yet developed the full range of objections available to adults. They have fewer resources, less mobility, less authority, more dependence. So when a rule needs a body to sit upon, the body of a child is often chosen, not out of cruelty, out of ease. And ease, again, has a way of becoming tradition. What is easy to enforce becomes normal. What is normal becomes expected. What is expected becomes moral. And once something is moral, it becomes very difficult to question without sounding unreasonable. So now, perhaps, a parent hesitates. A boy has reached that uncertain age. There is talk of placing him in a town. There is also talk of keeping him where he is. And hovering over all this is the sense that there are rules, not always written clearly, not always enforced consistently, but present, felt, respected enough to influence decisions, ignored just enough to allow movement. And this produces a strange effect. The system appears stable, it appears governed, it appears intentional. But beneath that surface, it is constantly shifting, adjusting, negotiating. A boy leaves when he should not. A master takes him when he is not supposed to. A family agrees to something quietly. An official looks the other way. Another official does not. A fine is paid. A warning is given. Nothing changes. Everything continues. This is how temporary rules refuse to leave, not by becoming rigid, by becoming adaptable. And adaptability is a very persuasive form of permanence, because it allows the rule to survive conditions it was never designed for. The labor market changes, the population shifts, the needs of towns and countryside evolve, and the rule, instead of breaking, bends. It means slightly different things in slightly different places. It is interpreted rather than followed, and in that interpretation, it lives on. Meanwhile, the boy still becomes transferable, whether at 12 or 13 or 14, or whenever the local version of the rule loosens its grip enough to allow it. Because no matter how many rules are written to contain movement, movement has its own logic. Families still need relief, masters still need labor, cities still grow, opportunities still whisper, and children still reach that awkward, in-between state where they are no longer small enough to be carried by childhood and not yet strong enough to negotiate adulthood, which makes them, once again, ideal for systems that prefer compliance. So, the rule remains, not because it works perfectly, but because it works just enough. And because removing it would require someone to admit that it was never entirely necessary in the first place, which is something institutions rarely enjoy admitting. It is far more comfortable to pretend that what exists now has always existed, that it was always needed, always justified, always part of the natural order of things. Even if, somewhere in the distant past, it began as nothing more than a practical response to a bad year. And so, the boy, standing at that uncertain age, finds himself shaped not only by the needs of households and masters, but by rules that were never written with him specifically in mind. Rules that speak about him, decide for him, restrict him, permit him, delay him, release him, without ever quite acknowledging that he is the one carrying them forward. Because that is another quiet truth. Systems do not continue on their own. They require bodies. And in this case, those bodies are young, still adjusting, still learning, still absorbing the weight of expectations they did not create. And as long as there are children reaching that age, and adults ready to decide what should happen to them, the rule will not disappear. It will change its wording, it will soften its tone, it will shift its emphasis. But it will remain, because what began as temporary has, by now, become too familiar to let go. And familiarity, more than logic, is what keeps most human arrangements alive. Not all children stayed. That is something the system never quite managed to solve. It could arrange beds, assign work, create rules, speak in the language of duty, structure, and improvement. But it could not entirely prevent a child from deciding, quietly and often without ceremony, that he would rather not be there anymore. Running away, like most things in the medieval world, did not begin as rebellion in the grand sense. It began as discomfort, small at first, a bed that never quite warms, food that is never quite enough, a voice in the house that never softens, a task that repeats too often, a mistake that is remembered longer than it should be, a feeling hard to name that something is not right. And at 12 or 13 or 14, a child does not always understand dissatisfaction as a system. He understands it as a feeling in the body, a heaviness in the morning, a reluctance in the hands, a quiet delay before rising, a longer look at the door. The necessary. These are not dramatic acts, they are small hesitations. But small hesitations have a way of gathering weight, because they repeat, morning after morning, task after task, correction after correction, and eventually something shifts, not loudly, not with declaration, but with a decision that forms almost by accident. What if I left? The question itself is fragile. It cannot be held for too long without being dismissed. There are rules, there are expectations, there is the knowledge, even if not fully understood, that leaving is not permitted in the neat, respectable version of things. But rules, as we have seen, are rarely absolute. They exist, they press, they shape behavior, but they do not fully seal it, and the world outside the house remains visible: the street, the market, the edge of town, the road, leading somewhere else. All of it continues to exist, even when the child is told to ignore it, especially then, because being told not to look at something has always been one of the most effective ways to make it interesting. So the boy notices. He notices other boys, boys who are not in his house, boys who move more freely, boys who laugh in ways that do not seem measured, boys who carry things, yes, but who are not called back so sharply. He notices travelers. He notices carts. He notices that movement is possible. And slowly, the idea that he is fixed begins to feel less certain. This is dangerous, not in the dramatic sense of immediate harm, in the quieter sense of destabilizing expectation, because the system depends on continuity, on the boy waking up tomorrow in the same place, on the tasks being done, on the rhythm continuing. Running interrupts rhythm, and interruption is deeply inconvenient, which is why it is treated seriously, but seriousness does not prevent it, because discomfort repeated long enough becomes intention, and intention, given even the smallest opportunity, becomes action. Perhaps it happens early. Before the household fully wakes, the boy rises. Not loudly, not differently enough to attract notice. He has learned, by now, how to move quietly. That was one of his first lessons. How to be present without drawing attention. And now, ironically, that skill serves him in leaving. He gathers nothing, or almost nothing, because what is there to gather? A child in such a place does not possess much that is truly his. Clothing, perhaps, but even that is uncertain. A blanket, but that belongs to the house. A tool, but that is not his to take. So he leaves as he came, with little, which makes leaving easier, in a practical sense, and harder in another, because there is nothing to anchor him, no weight to slow him, no possession to remind him of belonging. He steps outside, and for a moment, the world feels open, not safe, not welcoming, but wide. And width, after confinement, can feel like possibility. This is the dangerous part, not the leaving itself, the moment just after. When the child believes, however briefly, that he has escaped something, because escape suggests distance, and distance suggests freedom. But medieval towns and the roads between them are not designed to accommodate unsupervised children kindly. They are not empty, they are not gentle, they are not waiting to receive. They are simply there, and the boy, now outside the household that defined him, must decide what he is, which is a question the system had already answered for him. Apprentice, servant, boy, useful, now. Without that label actively applied, he becomes something less clear, a child alone, which is a more complicated category. He might try to find work, but work, in this world, is often attached to households, to masters, to arrangements, to agreements, and he has just broken one. He might try to return home, but home may not be available in the way he remembers. The reason he left in The first place has not disappeared. The household he came from may not have space, may not have food, may not welcome a return that complicates what was already a difficult decision. So he walks, or waits, or lingers. And in this in-between space, the system begins to reach for him again, because systems do not like loose ends. A boy who runs is not simply lost. He is misplaced, and misplaced things are noticed. Not always immediately, not always with urgency, but eventually a master realizes the boy is gone. A question is asked. Another boy is questioned. A servant shrugs. A guess is made. Perhaps he has gone to the market. Perhaps he has been sent on an errand. Perhaps he is late. And then, slowly, the realization settles. He has left. And this creates inconvenience. Work remains undone. Tasks unfulfilled. The rhythm interrupted. And, more than that, there is something else. A kind of challenge. Because if one boy leaves, others might imagine it. And imagination is harder to control than action. So the response forms, not always as a chase, not always with immediate pursuit, but as a reassertion. The boy is expected to return. He is spoken of as though his absence is temporary. Because to accept that he has left fully would be to accept that the arrangement is not as stable as it appears. And stability, even when imperfect, is something institutions defend carefully. So stories are told, he will be found, he will come back. He cannot manage on his own, he will realize his mistake, he will return, and sometimes he does. Because the world outside the structure is not kind. Hunger arrives quickly, confusion follows. Opportunities do not present themselves as easily as imagined. Freedom without support becomes another kind of discomfort. And so the boy who left because of one set of difficulties encounters another, different, less structured, less predictable. And sometimes that is enough to turn him back. Not because the original situation has improved, because it is known. And known discomfort can feel safer than unknown uncertainty. This is another quiet mechanism of the system. It does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be more predictable than the alternative. And predictability, even when harsh, has a certain pull. So the boy returns, perhaps quietly, perhaps with explanation, perhaps with apology, perhaps with punishment waiting, because running away is not neutral. It disrupts. It challenges. It must be answered. Not necessarily with cruelty, though cruelty is not absent from such moments, but with correction, with reinforcement, with a reminder that leaving is not as simple as stepping through a door. And yet, even with this, the running does not stop, because not all boys return. Some continue, some find other places, other masters, other arrangements, less formal, less secure, but sufficient. Some disappear into the movement of towns, into labor that is not recorded, into lives that do not follow the intended path of apprenticeship, but still function within the broader economy. And these boys, though less visible, still exist, which means the system is never complete. It always leaks, always loses, always adjusts. And that, perhaps, is why it endures, because it does not require perfection, only persistence. The children who ran become part of the story, but not the whole of it. They are examples, warnings, occasional disruptions, but the majority remain because leaving is difficult, because staying is easier in a certain sense. Because the structure, once entered, is hard to exit without cost, and because the world beyond it offers no guarantees. So the boy who stays watches the boy who ran and learns something, not necessarily that running is impossible, but that it is uncertain. And uncertainty is something the system uses quietly. It does not need to forbid every path. It only needs to make the alternative less appealing, less predictable, less survivable, and in doing so, it keeps most children where they are, working, learning perhaps, serving, certainly, sleeping in the same bed, waking to the same rhythm, becoming part of the structure that once felt temporary and now feels, if not permanent, then at least inescapably present. It is very easy, when speaking about apprentices, to imagine boys, boys in workshops, boys holding tools too large for their hands, boys being corrected, instructed, sent, shouted at, shaped. It is a very convenient image, clear, recognizable, recorded. And that last part matters more than it should, because what is recorded begins to feel real, and what is not recorded begins to fade, even if it was just as present. So while the boy is standing in the workshop, trying to understand how to hold something correctly without being corrected too sharply, there is, somewhere nearby, another kind of work happening, quieter, less announced, less likely to be written down in neat lines, but no less binding. A girl, perhaps younger, or perhaps not, placed in another household, not called an apprentice, not always, not described with the same careful language of trade and training, but there, working, learning, serving, becoming useful in ways that do not always attract the dignity of formal recognition, which is, in itself, a kind of pattern, because systems tend to name what they value most clearly, and they tend to blur what they expect quietly. So, a boy is apprenticed, a girl is placed. The difference in wording seems small. It is not. One suggests a future, the other suggests a function. And yet, if one looks closely enough, the two experiences begin to resemble each other in ways that are difficult to ignore. She leaves home, often earlier, 10, perhaps. Sometimes younger, not because she is more prepared, because she is more easily absorbed. That is the uncomfortable truth. A household can find use for a girl quickly. There is always something to be done, always something to clean, to prepare, to maintain, to assist, to repeat. Work that does not require the formal language of a craft to justify itself. Work that exists simply because people live together and must continue doing so. And so the arrangement begins, not loudly, not ceremonially, not with contracts that emphasize learning, but with understanding. She will stay, she will help, she will be fed, she will be housed, she will learn what she needs to know, which is a phrase that sounds generous until one asks who decides what she needs to know. And the answer, of course, is the household, not the girl. So she enters another space, another rhythm, another set of expectations that are not explained in full because explanation is rarely considered necessary. She watches, listens, repeats. She learns how things are done here because this house is not her house, and the rules are not transferable. That is one of the quiet difficulties of this kind of life. Skills do not exist in isolation. They are embedded in habits, and habits change from house to house. So what was correct before may be wrong now. What was acceptable there may be corrected here. What was sufficient may now be careless. And the girl must adjust quickly, because adjustment is expected, not admired, expected. And within that expectation, something familiar begins to form. She becomes useful, at first, in the same small ways, carrying, cleaning, preparing, watching, anticipating, the invisible work that makes visible work possible. And, just as with the boy, usefulness expands. If she can do this, she can do more. If she can be trusted, she can be relied upon. If she can be relied upon, she becomes part of the structure. And once she is part of the structure, the question of whether she is learning something becomes less urgent, because the household is functioning, and function is a persuasive argument. So the idea of training appears, but softly, not announced, not structured, but present in fragments. She learns how to prepare food, not as a lesson, as a necessity. She learns how to mend because things tear. She learns how to manage small economies of the house. Because resources are limited, she learns how to speak to customers, perhaps, or how not to. She learns how to move around the authority of the mistress, which is, in many households, a form of education as complex as any craft. And this, too, becomes tradition. Not because anyone designed a system for training girls in a structured way, because households needed help, and help, repeated long enough, becomes expectation. Expectation becomes pattern. Pattern becomes something that feels like it has always existed. And so, without quite naming it, a parallel system forms. Girls working, girls learning, girls being shaped, girls becoming part of households that are not their own. And yet, because this system is quieter, it is also more flexible, less bound by formal rules, less constrained by guild structures, which can be both advantage and disadvantage. She may learn more broadly, a range of tasks, a kind of adaptability, a way of moving through different kinds of work without needing formal recognition. But she may also lack protection, lack clarity, lack the promise, however imperfect, that something at the end of this process will be recognized as a trade, and so her position remains uncertain, which, again, is a very useful position for a system. Uncertainty allows adjustment. It allows expectations to shift. It allows work to expand without needing renegotiation. It allows the household to take what it needs when it needs it, and to describe that taking in whatever language feels most appropriate: help, training, preparation, duty, care. All of these words can be used, all of them can be true, and none of them fully capture the experience. Because the experience, as with the boy, is not one thing, it is a mixture. Service and learning, obedience and adaptation, skill and repetition, expectation and improvisation. And within all this, something else develops, a kind of quiet awareness. She learns not only how to do things, but how to exist within a structure that does not center her, how to move without interrupting, how to speak without challenging, how to observe without being noticed, how to anticipate needs before they are expressed. These are not written in any contract. They are not listed as skills, but they are learned. And once learned, they are difficult to unlearn, which is how temporary arrangements become permanent behaviors. The girl who was placed for practical reasons becomes a woman who carries those habits forward, not because she chose them, because they were effective, because they allowed her to function, because they were rewarded, or at least not punished. And the system, again, has done its work. Without declaring itself, without needing to justify itself in grand terms, it simply continues. Another girl arrives, another placement is made, another household absorbs another body into its rhythm, and the same patterns repeat, with small variations, different temperaments, different conditions, different degrees of kindness or harshness, but the structure remains quiet, flexible, persistent, and because it is quiet, it is rarely questioned loudly. It is simply how things are done, which is one of the most powerful phrases in any society. Because once something is described that way, it becomes difficult to imagine alternatives. The girl works, the girl learns, the girl stays until she leaves. And when she leaves, she carries with her not just what she has been taught, but how she has been shaped, which in many cases is exactly what the system required. Not just labor, but continuity. At some point, the boy begins to realize that the workshop is not the whole story. It feels like it should be. There is the bench, the tools, the materials, the master, the work itself. All the things that seem, at first, to define what he is becoming. If he is learning a trade, then surely this is the place where that learning lives. But slowly, almost without noticing when it began, other things start to appear. Things that do not belong to the trade, and yet somehow cannot be separated from it. A gathering, perhaps? Not for work? Not exactly? Men from the same craft? Meeting somewhere that is not quite the workshop, and not quite a place of leisure? There are voices. There is discussion. There is a tone of seriousness that feels different from the urgency of daily labor. It is slower, heavier, more collective. The boy is not always invited, but he notices, because things change on those days. The master dresses slightly differently, speaks in a slightly different way, returns with a mood that carries something from outside the house. And whatever that something is, it settles into the workshop without being explained. This is how institutions reveal themselves, not through instruction, through atmosphere. The boy learns, eventually, that the trade is not just what happens at the bench. It belongs to something larger, a group, a body, a structure that exists beyond any single house. And that structure has its own habits, its own expectations, its own strange, inherited obligations that seem, at times, only loosely connected to the work itself. There are candles, for example, candles that must be provided, not for light in the workshop, for something else, a church perhaps, a chapel, a place where members of the craft gather, not to work, but to be seen in another way, standing together, recognized, ordered, not as individuals, but as part of something that extends beyond them. And the boy watches this with a kind of confusion, because he thought he was learning how to shape material, and now it seems he is also learning how to belong to a body that shapes behavior. The two are not separate, they never were, but the connection is not obvious at first. So he continues to observe. There are feasts, days when the work pauses or shifts, or rearranges itself around something that feels both important and slightly unnecessary. Food appears in different forms, voices rise, stories are told, laughter happens in ways that are not entirely controlled, and yet, even here, there is structure. Who sits where? Who speaks first? Who is listened to? Who is tolerated? Who is ignored? The hierarchy of the workshop does not disappear. It simply changes costume, and the boy begins to understand that learning a trade also means learning one's place within a layered system of belonging, which includes things that seem, at first, irrelevant, like processions, or watches, or duties that pull men away from their work and into something that looks almost like performance. A night, perhaps, cold, the city, quiet in that particular way that suggests it is not truly asleep, only waiting, men moving through the streets, watching, not because they have chosen to, because they are expected to, because this is part of what it means to belong to the craft, and the boy, if he is old enough, or if the household requires it, may be present, not fully participating, but near enough to feel the weight of it. And this is where things become slightly strange, because the work of the craft is no longer limited to producing goods. It includes maintaining the city, guarding it, supporting it, sometimes even defending it, which is not what anyone mentioned when he was first placed in the house. No one said, "You will learn to make things, and also to stand in the cold at night because your master belongs to a group that has obligations beyond its trade." That part arrives later, quietly, as though it has always been there, and perhaps, in a sense, it has, because these structures tend to grow in layers. A craft begins as work, then it becomes organized, then it becomes responsible, then it becomes involved in things that have nothing to do with the original purpose. And all of this accumulates, like dust or like tradition. No one quite remembers when it started, only that it exists and must be maintained. There are other moments, too, less solemn, more absurd. A procession, perhaps, figures carried through the streets, symbols, representations, things that feel theatrical, but are taken seriously. The boy watches, trying to understand how this connects to the work he does every day, and the answer is not clear, because the connection is not logical, it is historical. Something happened once. A need arose, a duty was assigned, a celebration was held, a gesture was made, and then it was repeated, and repeated, and repeated again, until it became part of what the craft is, not because it is necessary, because it is inherited. And inheritance is one of the strongest forces in any system, stronger, sometimes, than reason. So the boy learns to accept these things, not immediately, but gradually, because questioning them would require time, and time, as always, is limited. The day is full, the work continues, the household expects, the body tires, and within that cycle there is little room to step back and ask why, which is, perhaps, how such arrangements survive so well. They are experienced, not analyzed, lived, not questioned, and by the time the boy has the capacity to question them, he is already part of them, already shaped by them, already carrying their habits in his own behavior. So he attends when required. He stands where he is placed. He participates in rituals he does not fully understand. He contributes to duties he did not choose, and in doing so, he becomes part of something that extends far beyond his original placement. What began as a simple arrangement between a household and a child has now expanded into a network of expectations that include religion, community, authority, and performance, all layered on top of each other, all accepted as normal, And within this, something subtle happens. The idea of the individual begins to soften, not disappear, but adjust, because the boy is no longer just himself. He is part of a household, part of a trade, part of a group, part of a city, each layer adding its own expectations, its own rules, its own quiet pressures. And the more layers there are, the harder it becomes to step outside them. Because stepping outside one is not enough. You would have to step outside all of them, and that is not easily done. So most do not try. They continue working, participating, repeating, and the system continues with them, growing not by design, but by accumulation. A duty here, a ritual there, a rule that was once temporary, a habit that proved useful, a gesture that became expected, all of it settling into place until the entire structure feels inevitable, which is the most convincing illusion of all, because nothing in it was inevitable when it began. It was built piece by piece, moment by moment, decision by decision. And yet, to the boy standing in the workshop, watching the candle burn for a reason he does not fully understand, or walking through a street as part of a duty that was never explained to him in the language of choice, it does not feel constructed. It feels given. And what feels given is rarely questioned, which is how systems endure. Not through force alone, but through familiarity, through repetition, through the quiet merging of work, belief, obligation, and identity into something that no longer needs to explain itself. And so the boy continues, learning the trade, serving the household, participating in the structure, becoming, without quite noticing when it happened, part of the inheritance. There is a moment, though it is difficult to notice exactly when it happens, when the boy stops feeling new. No one announces it, no one marks it. There is no ceremony for the end of being recently arrived. And yet it passes, quietly, almost politely. At first, everything was unfamiliar. The sounds, the smells, the rhythm of the house, the way work began before the body had fully agreed to wake, the way correction came quickly, the way expectation seemed to arrive before. Understanding, all of that felt sharp, distinct, noticeable. But over time, the edges soften. Not because the conditions have changed, because the boy has. He no longer pauses before moving. He no longer waits to be told where things are. He no longer hesitates in the same visible way. And this, in the language of the household, is improvement. He has adjusted. He has learned. He has become useful, which is a word that appears simple, but carries a great deal of weight, because usefulness, in this world, does not wait for maturity. It does not wait for growth. It does not wait for understanding. It arrives early, and once it arrives, it stays. The boy is still young, still incomplete, still, in many ways, uncertain, but none of that prevents him from being required, from being relied upon, from being expected to function within the system, as though he has already become something more than he is. And this creates a strange condition. He is not yet grown, but he is already necessary, which is a very uncomfortable place to exist, because necessity brings pressure, expectation, responsibility, and yet without the recognition that usually accompanies those things. He is not a master, not even close. He is not independent. He does not choose his work. He does not control his time. And yet If he fails, the effects are real. A task undone, a mistake repeated, a delay in the rhythm, a small disruption that ripples outward. And he feels this, not as theory, as reaction, a look, a word, a correction that lands more heavily than before, because now he is supposed to know, which is another quiet shift. At the beginning, ignorance is expected. Later, it becomes less acceptable, and the space between those two states is not clearly marked. One day he does not know, the next he should, and no one has told him when the change occurred. So he begins to carry something new, not just tasks, but expectation. And expectation, when carried without full understanding, has a way of becoming weight. He learns to anticipate more quickly, to correct himself before correction arrives, to move with a kind of cautious confidence that is less about certainty and more about avoiding disruption, because disruption draws attention, and attention in this context is rarely comfortable. So he becomes smoother, more efficient, more integrated into the rhythm of the house. And this integration is praised, though not always in words. A lack of correction, a nod, a task given without instruction. These are the signals. He is becoming part of the structure, and yet, even as this happens, something else lingers. He is still not free. He is still not in control. He is still moving within boundaries set by others. So his usefulness exists without autonomy, which is, again, a very effective arrangement, because it allows the system to benefit from his growing ability without granting him the power that might accompany it. He can do more, but he does not decide more. He understands more, but he does not choose more. And this creates a kind of quiet tension, not always conscious, but present, because the body knows when it is capable of something, even if the system does not acknowledge it fully. So there are moments, small ones, when the boy notices that he can do a task without thinking, that he can correct another, younger hand, that he understands something that was once confusing. And in those moments, there is a flicker of something like confidence, or perhaps just recognition. I can do this, which is a simple thought, but a powerful one, and yet it does not lead immediately to change, because the system is not designed to respond quickly to individual development. It moves at its own pace, which is slower. He must wait, continue, repeat, and in that repetition, the idea of growth becomes stretched, extended, delayed, not denied, exactly, but not accelerated either, because the system benefits from this middle state, not a child, not an adult, capable but not autonomous, useful but not independent. It is a very productive position, and so it is maintained, not always intentionally, not always with awareness, but consistently, because it works, and because changing it would require adjusting the balance, which is something systems resist. So the boy continues to live in this in-between, working as though he is older, being treated as though he is younger, expected to understand, allowed, only to follow. And this shapes him, not just in skill, but in behavior. He learns patience, not the gentle kind, the enforced kind. He learns to wait, to endure, to continue, without clear markers of progress. He learns that improvement does not always lead to immediate reward, that recognition is inconsistent, that effort is expected regardless of outcome. These are not lessons anyone writes down, but they are learned repeatedly, and they stay, because once learned, they become part of how he moves through the world, even beyond this house. even beyond this trade, which is, perhaps, one of the most lasting effects of the system. Not the skill itself, but the habits formed around it, the way of responding to authority, the way of managing expectation, the way of existing within structures that do not fully acknowledge the individual. And this, too, becomes tradition, passed on not through instruction, but through repetition. A new boy arrives. He is uncertain, awkward, watching, and the older boy, now more confident, begins to respond to him in ways that mirror what he experienced. Not exactly, but closely enough, because that is what he knows. That is what worked. That is what was expected. And so the pattern continues, not because anyone insists upon it directly, because it has become natural, familiar, embedded, and in this way, the system sustains itself through behavior, through imitation, through the quiet passing of habits from one generation to the next, without needing to explain itself, without needing to justify itself. It simply continues. And the boy, now less new, more capable, still not fully grown, moves within it, working, learning, waiting, becoming, not all at once, not in a straight line, but gradually, in the slow, repetitive way that defines most human change. And somewhere within that process, the original idea that he was placed here to learn remains, not entirely false, not entirely fulfilled, but present, lingering, like many promises that are never fully examined once they become part of everyday life. There is something else that begins to happen, slowly, almost imperceptibly, once usefulness settles into the bones. The boy stops counting time the way he used to. At the beginning, days felt long, heavy, separate from one another, each one noticeable, each one something to endure. But repetition has a way of softening the edges of time. Days begin to resemble each other. Morning arrives. Work begins. Correction comes. Food is taken. Work continues. Evening lowers itself quietly into the corners of the room, and then night, and then again, and again, and again, until time becomes less like a series of events and more like a surface he is moving across without clear markers. And this is important because when time blurs, expectation becomes easier to carry, not lighter, just less distinct. A child who can point to a specific day and say this is difficult is still measuring. A child who no longer distinguishes between days has begun to adapt. And adaptation, in this world, is often mistaken for acceptance. He no longer asks when things will change, not out loud, not even fully in his own thoughts, because the question itself requires a sense that change is scheduled, that there is a moment ahead when things will become different. But the system does not offer such moments clearly. It offers duration, a stretch of time, a term, years, perhaps, long enough that the idea of the end becomes vague, distant, almost theoretical. And so the boy lives inside continuation, which is one of the quietest forms of control, not force, not restriction in the obvious sense, but the absence of clear endings. Because when something does not have a defined edge, it is difficult to push against it. You cannot resist what you cannot see the limits of. So instead, you move within it. You adjust. You settle. And over time, the body becomes very good at this. The hands no longer hesitate. The back learns how to bend without protest, or at least without visible protest. The feet find their places without thought. Even the mind becomes more efficient. It stops asking unnecessary questions, stops imagining alternative arrangements too frequently, because imagining requires energy, and energy in this life is carefully spent. This is where the system becomes almost elegant, not in a moral sense, in a functional one, because it does not need to enforce every behavior. It shapes conditions in which certain behaviors become easier than others, easier to continue than to stop, easier to comply than to resist, easier to move with the rhythm than to break it. And the boy, now no longer new, begins to contribute to this without realizing it. He becomes part of the rhythm that once shaped him. He rises on time. He moves correctly. He anticipates. He fills gaps. He smooths interruptions. He corrects small things before they grow larger. And in doing so, he helps maintain the very structure that limits him, which is one of the more complicated ironies. Because now, if another boy arrives, uncertain and awkward, the older one, this same boy may find himself responding with the same patterns he once struggled against. Not because he intends to repeat them, because they are effective, because they are familiar, because they keep the day moving. So he corrects, briefly, perhaps sharply, without thinking too much about it, because thinking too much would slow things down, and slowing things down is rarely encouraged. And in that moment, the system folds back on itself. The one who was shaped becomes a shaper, not fully, not with authority, but enough. Enough to pass something along, enough to ensure continuity. And continuity is what matters. More than fairness, more than clarity, more than intention. So the pattern deepens, quietly, without announcement, without needing to be defended. It simply continues. And somewhere within this continuation, the boy begins to experience something else. A kind of distance from the idea of childhood, not because he has become an adult, but because childhood, as he knew it, no longer fits. It does not match his days, his responsibilities, his expectations. And yet, he is not fully something else. He exists in a space that does not have a clean name, not child, not man, something in between. And that space is where the system does its most effective work, because it is undefined, flexible, capable of absorbing expectation without granting identity. He can be told to act like an adult and reminded he is still a boy, depending on what is needed in the moment. And this shifting is not explained. It is simply experienced, which makes it harder to resist, because there is nothing stable to argue against. Only movement, only adjustment, only the quiet understanding that one must continue. And so he does. He continues, through days that blur, through work that repeats, through small improvements that are noticed only when they fail, through expectations that grow without announcement, through a life that is not quite his own, but not entirely. And sometimes, in the middle of all this, something very small happens, something almost insignificant, a moment where he is left alone with a task, trusted, perhaps, or simply assumed to be capable. No instruction given, no correction waiting, just the work. And in that moment, he realizes that he knows what to do. Not perfectly, not confidently, but enough. Enough to begin, enough to continue. And this realization is quiet. It does not arrive with celebration. No one stops to acknowledge it, but it matters, because it is one of the first times the boy experiences something like independence. Not given, not granted, but discovered. And it is fragile, because it exists within a structure that still controls everything around it. But it is there, and once it is there, it does not entirely disappear. Even if it is not encouraged, even if it is not expanded, it remains a small, persistent awareness that he is capable of more than he is allowed to express. And this awareness changes something, not outwardly, not dramatically, but internally, in the way he holds himself, in the way he watches, in the way he waits, because now waiting is not just obedience, it is also observation. He sees more, understands more, not just the work, the system, the patterns, the expectations, the quiet compromises, the unspoken rules, and once seen, these things cannot be unseen, which is both useful and inconvenient. Because understanding a system does not always give you the ability to leave it. Often, it simply makes your place within it clearer. And clarity in such situations is not always comforting, but it is something. And in a world where so much is dictated, even a small understanding can feel like a kind of possession, something that belongs to him, even if nothing else does. And so the days continue, not in a straight line, not in a way that can be easily measured or neatly understood, just continuing. Morning still arrives before it is welcome. The house still wakes before the body is ready. The work still waits, patient in the way that work always is. And the boy, though he is no longer quite the boy who arrived, moves within it all with a familiarity that once would have felt impossible. He no longer notices certain things. The cold of the floor in the early hours, the weight of the first task, the sound of correction, the small discomforts that once stood out now blend into something softer, not gone, just absorbed. This is what repetition does. It does not remove difficulty. It teaches the body to carry it without comment. And that, in many ways, is the final lesson. Not the trade, not the rules, not even the structure, but the ability to continue, to wake, to move, to work, to exist, within something that was never chosen, but has become familiar enough to remain. And somewhere in that familiarity, something else fades. The idea that this was ever temporary. At the beginning, everything was described that way. A few years, a period of learning, a stage before something else. But time, when it is lived rather than counted, has a way of dissolving those boundaries. The days do not announce where one phase ends and another begins. They simply accumulate, and within that accumulation, the temporary stretches, lengthens, softens at the edges until it becomes difficult to distinguish from permanence. Not because it was meant to be permanent, because it was never interrupted. And that is often all permanence requires. Not intention, not design, just continuation. The boy, older now, though not entirely grown, no longer stands at the edge of the system. He is inside it, fully moving with it, supporting it, carrying small parts of it in his own habits, his own expectations, his own way of responding to the world. And this is how the contract completes itself, not on paper, not with signatures or formal endings, but in the body, in the way the hands move without instruction, in the way the mind anticipates without asking, in the way the day unfolds without needing explanation. Childhood, once something soft and loosely held, has been reshaped, Not removed, not entirely, but narrowed, directed, aligned with usefulness. And usefulness, once established, does not easily leave. It stays. It becomes part of how a person understands themselves, what they are for, what they are expected to be. And long after the house changes, long after the master is no longer the one giving orders, long after the structure itself loosens or shifts or is left behind, that sense remains, quiet, persistent, almost invisible, the habit of being needed, the habit of continuing, the habit of fitting into something larger without asking too many questions about it. And perhaps, sometimes, very quietly, there is a moment, not dramatic, not life-changing, just a pause, a brief awareness that things could have been otherwise, that this arrangement, which now feels so natural, was once something new, something decided, something constructed. And that thought lingers for a moment, before the next task arrives, before the next movement, before the rhythm resumes. And the rhythm always resumes, because that is what it does. It continues.